In this section, we will go over interviewing children at school, intake screener scenarios, child welfare investigations, temporary custody, children with developmental disabilities, incidents of abuse, types of abuse, hidden disabilities, risk factors, behavioral indicators, disability symptoms mimicking signs of abuse, other considerations. A representative from a child protective agency may deem it necessary to interview the child at school. Again, you should never be the person doing the interview. Only someone from the child protective agency or law enforcement should interview the child. Under the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, schools can release information to the investigating agencies without parental consent in cases of health and safety emergencies. When you call in possible abuse or neglect, an intake screener will do one of the following: assign the case to a worker requiring an immediate response, assign the case to a worker requiring a 10-day response, screen the case out with full documentation. This decision is decided by the intake screener at the agency. While doing a child welfare investigation, the emergency response worker may substantiate abuse or neglect, make an inconclusive finding, or determine the report was unfounded. All substantiated and inconclusive reports must be reported by the Child Protective Agency to the Child Abuse Central Index, CACI. The information obtained by the CACI is available to aid law enforcement investigations, prosecutions, and to provide notification of new child abuse investigation reports involving the same suspects and/or victims. Information is also provided to designated social welfare agencies to help screen applicants for licensing or employment in child care facilities and foster homes, and to aid in background checks of other possible child placement and adoptions. So the information they receive is key to making sure the wrong people are not around children. If a social worker finds immediate danger or immediate need for medical care, they may take custody of the child. This is when law enforcement gets involved, and it will fall under WIC 305 and 306, which gives them authority to take a custody of the child without a warrant. Some of our educators interact daily with children who have disabilities. Americans with Disabilities identifies a disability in an individual in part as a physical or mental impairment. This impairment substantially limits one or more major life activities of that individual. There will also be a record of such an impairment. A major life activity may include caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping, walking, standing, lifting, bending, speaking, breathing, learning, reading, concentrating, thinking, communicating, and working. Major life activity also includes the operation of major bodily functions, such as functions of the immune system, normal cell growth, digestive, bowel, bladder, neurological, brain, respiratory, circulatory, endocrine, or reproductive functions. According to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act amendments, a child with a disability is a child with mental retardation, hearing impairments including deafness, speech or language impairments, visual impairments including blindness, serious emotional disturbance, orthopedic impairments, autism, traumatic brain injury, other health impairments, or specific learning disabilities. Developmental delays can include physical development, cognitive development, communication development, social or emotional development, or adaptive development. Appropriate diagnostic instruments and procedures will be used to measure the developmental disability. Because they are more vulnerable and have greater needs, children with disabilities are likely at a higher risk for abuse. In 1993, children with disabilities were 1.7 times more likely to be maltreated. In 2000, it increased to 3.4 times more likely to be maltreated. Studies have shown that those numbers have continued to increase. The most prevalent form of maltreatment is neglect. Studies have shown that children with disabilities are not only more likely to suffer maltreatment than their non-disabled peers, but they are more likely to suffer multiple incidents as well as multiple forms of maltreatment. Children with behavioral challenges may be at a higher risk for physical abuse because caregivers may have an unrealistic expectation and become frustrated. Caregivers caring for children with behavioral disorders need to be educated on the child's needs and limitations before being left with the child. Education is key to ensuring that a child's special health care and educational needs are being met. Unfortunately, most perpetrators of child abuse or neglect are family members or trusted friends of the family. These children are exposed to more potentially abusive situations because they are exposed to multiple caregivers both inside and outside the family. Educators should be alert for the existence of disabilities that have not been identified or diagnosed previously. This could be because they are not visible or because behavioral indicators have been overlooked for one reason or another. Most of the risk factors for abuse and neglect throughout this presentation apply to all children. However, children with disabilities have an additional disability-related issue. These are some of the following additional risk factors. May be used to adults touching their body without their permission because of their need for physical assistance. May be less likely to recognize dangerous situations, which makes them less likely or less able to take precautions. Can be exposed to multiple caregivers. Due to intellectual impairment, may be unable to distinguish between abusive and non-abusive acts. Be difficult to disclose abuse due to impaired communication. They are usually taught to be compliant. They are isolated and lack social support due to the negative view of society. They are rarely educated about abuse prevention. Oftentimes, abuse or neglect of the children with disabilities is identified through observation of physical signs or verbal disclosure by the child. If a child is unable to tell you they are being abused or neglected, behavior can be a good indicator. Even though some behavioral indicators are a result of the child's disability, a warning sign is any changes in those behaviors. Remember, some disability symptoms may be the result of abuse or neglect. We have covered physical and behavioral cues that may be indicative of abuse. However, some disabilities can create symptoms that mimic those of abuse or increased risk of accidental injury. Autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, is when a child may engage in repetitive behaviors that are self-injurious, which results in injuries that could be confused with symptoms of abuse. Cerebral palsy children suffer from the inability to control motor functions, which may impact their balance and cause involuntary movements. This can result in accidental injuries that can be confused with symptoms of abuse. Children with Prader-Willi syndrome may exhibit a number of concerning symptoms. These symptoms include having a high pain tolerance and unusual food-seeking behaviors. Also, these children may have additional learning, motor, and or speech disabilities. Children with Tourette's syndrome may use foul language and use words that can be sexually charged. Even though medication can help in increasing their verbal explosions, many times their outbursts cannot be eradicated completely. Some medications have an effect on the child's behavior. This behavior can vary throughout the day and can continue to change. Other medical conditions can cause a child to bruise easily and be predisposed to fractures. Some conditions can result in physical findings that are typically associated with abuse. This is why it is important for teachers who work with children with disabilities to be aware of any changes in a child's behavior or body. Abuse or neglect of a child with disabilities will be ignored and allowed to continue if an injury or behavioral change is incorrectly attributed to a child's disability. The possibility of neglect or abuse should always be evaluated, even if an injury can be attributed to the child's disability. Carefully evaluate your concerns and always err on the side of caution. Your concerns of abuse or neglect may be right on target. It is also important to work as a team if you suspect any maltreatment. So ask your peers what they think about possible abuse or neglect. Again, let me reiterate that the interview of a child should be done by a person who is trained in forensic interviewing of a child, and any investigation should be done by Child Protective Service agencies or law enforcement. Call to report any possible abuse or neglect to the appropriate agency. Do not forget to tell the agency if the use of an interpreter is needed. If the child with a disability uses an alternate method of communication, let the agency know what that alternate method is. I want to emphasize again that it is your responsibility to report any suspected abuse or neglect. You should never investigate or interview a child you suspect of being abused or neglected. That is the responsibility of the appropriate agency.